Hello, this is Steve Malone with Compass FX. I hope you're doing well today and you're getting some good trades. I want to talk more about trading with the pivots. And today I want to specifically focus your attention on the pivot levels when we get some consolidation of pivot levels. Now, for those of you not that familiar with the pivot, again, the daily pivot, the main pivot line that we work off of, is based on the previous day's high, low, and close added together and divided by 3. The pivot line is generally what the market's going to work off of or test the following day. Today, what I want to speak about is taking a look at all the pivot lines. When all the pivot lines consolidate into an area, now we're going to look for a breakout pattern of the pivot. And today, the CAD Yen gives us a great example of that. We've seen day after day that the market has been above the pivot. Oftentimes, again, the market will go back towards the pivot and then work off of it going to one of the pivot levels, R1, an R2, or an R3. Again, we open above the pivot. Typically, when you open above the pivot, your bias for the day is long. You open up below the pivot, your bias for the day is typically short. Now notice though that as we move day from day to day, the pivot levels are inclining. It's almost like we step up, we step up again. But notice here how all the pivot levels are consolidating. This is a setup of a breakout pattern. And what I suggest you do is to go back and look for the previous high and previous lows that set the breakout high and low. So if I look back in time, we can see that there's a high back here that the market's within, and there's a low right here that the market is within. So let's see what those barriers are. It's about 78.30 on the top side, and it's approximately about 77, 72 on the bottom. So we have about a 50 pip range here where the market is really tight down, and notice where the market is pretty much right on the pivot. We're going to look for this breakout. It appears at around the S1 and a breakout that appears to be pretty close to the R1 for the day. If the day continues like it is right now, then most likely we'll see the pivot open up about the same place. We might even see the pivot levels here tighten up a bit more. Again, what we'll be looking for then is a breakout pattern. And oftentimes when we go into a transitional phase is a good time to look for the breakout pattern. A transitional phase is where the market's been moving for a few days on one side of the pivot. Then you go through a changeover where we're going from one side of the pivot to the other side of the pivot, but the pivot continues to get tested. So in this case, we were above the pivot, we come below the pivot, we test it, we go a little bit above the pivot, we come back, we test it, break below. So this area right here is a transitional phase of the pivot. So just make note, when you go through a transitional phase of the pivot, then look for a breakout pattern near the pivot. And if the market is right around that pivot, look for the R1 and the S1 to be the potential breakout points, and you simply trade it to the R2 if we break the R1. You trade it to the S2 when you break the S1. If there's continuation in that day, in that direction of the break, then look for the next pivot level. Like if we break above the R2 and we have continuation, look for the R3. The market breaks down below the S1, you trade to the S2. If it continues, has some strength to the downside still, you look for the S3. Let's take a look at one other currency where we have a similar situation, and that's the Kiwi, the New Zealand dollar. We've seen for the last few days that it's been above the pivot. And now we go through the transitional phase. We're a little bit above it, a little bit below it, above it again, and it's testing a high, it looks like, from back here. So in this case, we're just a little bit above the R1 here, maybe almost to the R2 here with the high that we had today, and then this low here. So everything's been kind of adjusted to the upside. If the market continues as it's showing right now, there's a possibility that the pivot for tomorrow will be right around the R1. We might have the pivot levels themselves tighten down, and then we would look for a break of the new R1 or the new S1, and then we traded the next levels. Now in this case right here, things are fairly tight. we're only in a distance of about 80 to about 81.20. So that's only about a 40 pip range. If the market gets down tight like that, and you're well within the average daily range of a currency pair, then look for the breakout. Again, typically a breakout pattern of the pivot is going to happen during a transitional phase where the market has been moving above the pivot for 2 to 3, maybe 4 days, and then it starts going sideways because we're looking for a retracement back for the next 2 or 3 days. That transitional phase from the market playing above the pivot to below the pivot or vice versa, look for the breakout pattern to occur during that transitional phase. The tighter the breakout pattern appears, the tighter the R1 to the S1 is, the greater potential pop there is. Well, folks, this is Dean Malone with Compass FX. I hope some of the information about trading the breakout pattern of the pivot will help you out. Again, a nice setup we see going on in the CAD yen right now with the pivot differential of being about 50 pips. Look for that possible breakout on it. Look also for that possible breakout in the Kiwi dollar. Well, folks, Dean Malone with Compass FX. Y'all make it a great day. Get some good trades. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.